Our next panel will explore how AI is reshaping artistic expression, content creation, and production processes. Moderating the discussion is Jason Jamerson, Director of the XR Studio and Assistant Professor in Virtual Production and Immersive Media at LSU. Please welcome Jason and our panelists, Dr. Jesse Allison, Simonette Berry, and Dr. Marcus Lyle Brown. So I'll hand it over.
Great, thank you all for being here. I'm Jason, as he said, and I'm the director of the XR Studio. There we produce cutting-edge media and tools, so we worked on digital twinning as one of our last panelists right before we got up here mentioned. We worked on a Heisman Trophy campaign, videos for the Jaden Daniels campaign. We shoot commercial media, we do experimental music projects with Dr. Allison, and all kinds of fun, exciting things. And then I'll just ask each of us to share a little bit about our backgrounds. Marcus?
Sure, hi. Marcus Brown. I am a co-founder of Believe Entertainment and a partner at Digital Twin Studios. At Believe Entertainment, we've done a number of film productions in the state of Louisiana, consulting, attracting production to the area, consulting for building film commissions as well, and individuals who are leveraging the tax credits. At Digital Twin Studios, we do a lot of immersive learning development content for enterprise, education, in multiple sectors to include energy, hospitality, tourism, healthcare, etc.
Hi everyone, my name is Simonette Berry. I am the business agent for IATSE Local 478. We cover Louisiana, Mississippi, and Mobile, Alabama film and television workers. And IATSE stands for the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees, Moving Picture Technicians, Artists, and Allied Crafts. It's a mouthful. Across the United States and Canada, we are 170,000 strong. We are the union behind entertainment. So we have locals that cover film and television, stage, events, all sorts of things like that. My background before I became a labor union representative was as an artist, a sculptor, and a writer. Upon discovering the film and television industry, I realized I could make a really good living as an artist and have employer-paid health care, protection on the job, and have incredible opportunities for training and advancements in this field. It was so exciting to get to work with other artists and learn skills from other artists almost immediately when I started working in film and television. I've also produced and written and done production design on a documentary called City of a Million Dreams. So I've been working for the union for about 5 years, and recently in the spring of 2024, I was able to attend industry-wide labor negotiations, and a big facet of those labor negotiations was artificial intelligence and making sure that film and television workers were properly represented in those conversations. In addition, I sit on the executive board of Film Louisiana, which we advocate for film and television here in the state.
Thank you all for coming. My name is Jesse Allison, and I run a program here at LSU in experimental music and digital media. It's a joint program between the School of Music and the Center for Computation and Technology. And so we are basically looking at new technology and how it might be used to make music, and also dreaming up ideas about what kinds of things, technology we would want, and then doing the research and development to be able to develop that. My path here came through, I owned a business for 10 years that made technology, sensor interfaces, software for artists to be able to enable them to do interesting, novel work. Went through Ball State and helped them set up an institute for digital intermedia art. And then I was brought here to work on this program with the cultural computing area that Jason Jamerson is also in. So for me, it's been working with machine learning and all of the permutations of kind of interesting novel technologies as they emerge, and we are in the thick of it right now.
Great, so over the next 50 minutes, I'm going to pose a series of questions that I have on my phone, so I'm not checking the time, but we'll discuss these topics and how they affect our relevant fields, and then there will be time for questions afterwards. So first off, I just wanted to ask, in your networks, what's the conversation in AI right now? Where is it being used, and what's being said?
Sure. So in the film and television world, AI AI is a hot topic. All the producers that I'm talking to across the board are really concerned with their bottom lines. The production landscape it's shifting sands. It's constantly changing, and the market really right now is looking for ways to to save money and to make sure that they can make money off of these creative ideas. At the same time, the workers are concerned, and the artists and the technicians are really concerned with not being replaced, but the AI that we want to use becoming a tool rather than a replacement for the job. You may have seen in recent news articles, some Oscar nominated films like The Brutalist and Emilia Perez have come into question because The Brutalist used AI to enhance the accents of two of the lead actors in that film. And now those performances are up for an Oscar, and that begs the question, is it still Oscar worthy if it was enhanced in some way? In Emilia Perez, one of the actress's performances, her singing voice was enhanced by AI. So again, the question is that, enhancement, to what degree was it enhanced? Those accents or, and it goes for all art, right? Like, where is that line in creativity when you're using AI to generate something? Where is that line where it becomes the product of AI and not a product of a human? Or, and like towing that line, going back and forth between it. So if I'm designing something for production and I say, I want a painting in the style of Georgia O'Keeffe, and I, basically get 3 choices from AI, and I take one of those and I print it out and I put it on the wall. That's a little different from a tailored prompt that says not one artist's name, but I want this type of color scheme and this and this and that. I then take that and I make my own adjustments to it. Or I start with my own painting and then make adjustments from there. So there's a line, right? And it's like, it's constantly being debated. I think in January, the U.S. Copyright Office came out with a decision that basically, to me, said, it depends. It depends. It wasn't very clear. It kind of is like, it depends on case to case. It's very different. And so as workers, and in the conversation that we had, the many conversations that we had leading up to negotiations and during negotiations, we were in negotiations with the major studios, right? So we were sitting across the table from Apple, NBC, Netflix, like all the, Warner Brothers, all the big companies. And they are doing their own research at that very moment on AI. The only one that's at the table that has a policy on AI at that moment was Sony. Everybody else is still like intellectual property is a big red flag, what if? We don't know, we're still doing our own research. So we came up with a list of guidelines that are friendly to the worker and the artist, the technician, that allow exploration into AI and using AI as a tool in your work, but not replacing a job. So the jobs can't be replaced by AI. And part of that is keeping the prompts proprietary, right? So you don't have to come in one day and figure out how to do a certain process and then 2 days later hand your prompts over to your employer and then they replace you with the trained AI that you've just created with your own institutional knowledge. That can't happen. But what you can do under these new guidelines is have a conversation with your employer and say, okay, the employer is asking me to do this. Here are the tools that I'd want to use. Let's have a conversation about the best way to do that. Or AI might not be the best way to go about this task because it might be better to use something else. So that conversation is one that is now contractual. And also protections for entertainment workers are contractual. So if there is an intellectual property dispute, the employer is liable, but the employee would have to help and participate with that suit if it's based on their work. So they should have been following the AI policy, so they can't just say, it would be against AI, their AI internal policy to have like a printout of a Georgia O'Keeffe knockoff work, right? But if they have this proprietary prompt, they could share that prompt and say, this is how I got from point A to point B. So you can't, and it would go into that suit with intellectual property. So that's kind of where the conversation is. We are really focusing on training right now and upskilling because that's so important. Here in Louisiana, as part of our tax incentive program, so far $9.1 million from the film and entertainment tax credits has gone back into higher education. There are 18 higher education institutions across the state that have film and television programs, and we're encouraging everybody to start looking at what you guys are looking at LSU and training with these things as tools so that you can make even better art and music and writing and things like that. So training is going to be the linchpin, and that is the other thing that we talked about in our negotiations, that training is something that the employers and the unions are working on together, and developing those programs is going to be incredibly important because IATSE's been around for 130 years. We've been around through silent films going to talkies. We've been around through black and white television going to color television. We've been around through the genesis of the visual effects and CGI renaissance. We do not dig our heels in when it comes to technology. We know we have to roll with the punches and continue to educate ourselves in order to remain relevant. And so this is just another example of that. We're capturing this new work, we're upskilling our people, we're making sure the jobs are protected, but as other jobs phase out, we're phasing others in.
All right, this is a lot to work through. I think you had asked about, like, what are the people in our area, how are they feeling about this? And I would say that the two biggest things are curiosity, like, what can I do with this? What might I be able to do with this? And fear. Like, one, as an artist, will my stuff get stolen? Will somebody else just start automatically generating things that replace me, right? As a musician or as any type of arts right now. And there's some, fear-mongering kind of happening, but there's also some, legitimate issues about voice actors having their voice copied and then just generated, right? So things like this happening. And I'm in a kind of unique spot art-wise because music is almost always the last thing to get the new developments, right? It's text first, usually jumps from there over to images, from there over to video, and then from there finally music gets something cool, right? But we're at that spot where music is finally, stuff's happening with Suno, Udio, stuff like that, where it can just generate music on the fly. And there were some really interesting conversations earlier today, right? Some about there's kind of like no new ethical issues under the sun. And to some extent that's right? We've always had ownership issues, always, right? And who as an artist owns this? And when you make a variation of that, if it's sampled stuff, right? How much do you have to sample before it becomes, not yours, but you're stealing from someone else? And there's only a couple ways to get that done, or to figure out what those lines are. One is regulation, we don't want to hear. One is legislation, also don't want to hear. And the last one is litigation. And in the arts, entertainments, that's the one that we've relied upon typically throughout the years to finally iron out where the lines are. And it's really an interesting moment right now, I think, because those lines are becoming blurred again, and they are now, everything is up in litigation to find out what we can do. And if you're a company, that's a scary position. If you're an artist who's using AI, you can get ostracized for being caught using AI to generate stuff, right? If you're a company that has put an AI thing on their comic book cover, this happened where, well, the company actually didn't. They put an artist on there and got the claim that it was an AI generated image, and people went haywire, right? So there's sort of like this weird defensiveness against, am I faking it or stealing it or that kind of thing. So there's a ton of opportunity right now, but there's also this, everything is up in the air for a while, and it will be for a while. But it also is an opportunity for us to redefine, like, what do we want ownership to look like? What do we want to be able to use artistically? How do we want to be able to support artists through this stuff? If you think about Louisiana, you think about art, right? In music, film, in dance, in like the culture here is so rich. E.g., we have a great data set that people can then use for AI and hopefully pull the money back into Louisiana and into supporting the arts and stuff here. So I'll stop there. There's lots more to talk about, but I think that's a good start.
Yeah, other than that, for us, I look at this from a number of different perspectives, but I do embrace it immediately as a tool, like most things that we utilize. From that regard, as an actor, being a part of the Screen Actors Guild for 20 plus years, looking at the opportunities for AI and ADR, automated dialogue replacement. There's so many times that we've had to go into a studio and our voiceover, process to look at our own lines and make those changes. Sometimes productions historically have, and because of time, because of availability, because of money, because they're already in that process, they'll engage another actor to use my lines. So, they're giving them a job as well as, maybe taking a little bit from me in that regard, but understanding it from a producer standpoint, it's a time sensitivity, it's a budget sensitivity. But if we're in a situation where our own property, where we sign up for a production and we have the opportunity to leverage our intellectual property as an individual to then say, okay, if you need to utilize AI for what you're doing to do an accelerated version of automated dialogue replacement, that makes sense. I can be compensated for it. It's automated. It's beneficial to the producer. From the producer side, there's so many times on the films that we've produced that the costume designer, the set designer, et cetera, will say, hey, I've got this tool that I want to utilize. It's $200 or $2,000 for the production. Well, what is that going to give the production and what is it going to give you? And it's usually, we're going to save time, we're going to save money. So when you look at the opportunity for artificial intelligence to leverage that opportunity to utilize prompt engineering to help them accelerate their work, to make sure that they're covering everything that they need to cover, from continuity, from making sure that those wardrobes are period correct. Those are so many opportunities, and my wife and I as producers, have been sitting in a situation where we're noticing things that have been overlooked due to human error. And many times we know that in that process, we could have saved those opportunities and make sure that that didn't happen and it didn't come up on the screen. From a technologist or a project manager, same scenario. We're looking at opportunities. We just left the launch of the 3rd or 4th virtual production wall in Louisiana, sponsored by Louisiana Economic Development Foundation, Economic Development Fund. And in that process, we started immediately having the conversations about how virtual production can leverage artificial intelligence to accelerate the properties that go up on that wall, to optimize the bulbs, making sure that the maintenance process is done well. And then from an educator standpoint, how do we accelerate those opportunities to get the information into the students' hands, into the learners' hands, so they can accelerate their learning process so that they can get into the industry faster. Dr. Swartz and I are partners in a company called Betaversity, and we're looking at leveraging prompt engineering, teaching prompt engineering across multiple industries. And in that process, the entertainment industry is no different. Department heads, subordinates, interns, giving them the opportunities or providing them with the prompts and giving them the wheels necessary to accelerate that department's process. We see it as a tool. Of course, there are some ethical things that we need to be mindful of. Of course, there's some ownership issues, but as long as we do so from an ethical standpoint, we're mindful of the impact of that tool. Just like in a scene shop, you've got safety equipment. You've got protocols in that scenario to make sure that individuals do not hurt themselves. When we have a gun on set, we have to make sure that everyone knows there's a gun on set, and here's how we're going to do that, and here are the procedures. As long as we set those guardrails in place, we see it as a tool. We want to embrace it. It helps us accelerate our processes, minimize our budget, maximize the impact of what individuals see as the content that we're creating.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I was reading earlier, someone said that in the past, throughout history, as industries have been disrupted, we have seen some individuals lose out if they had to be reskilled or upskilled. But for the most part, overall, we see these industries explode in their rate of production, their scope of production. And so if we can use it as a tool, I was reading an article specifically this morning about a hand animation studio that does anime in Japan, and how they said they've incredibly increased what they can do. Because you think about those beautiful, hand animated, incredibly arduous tasks to create these pieces. They said for a sequence now, they're doing the first frame, they're doing the last frame, and they're generating what's in between using prompt engineering to control what happens, but then fully painting over each frame. But it saves them 90% of their time, which is incredible. So what do we think could happen? How could that benefit us across all of our?
I'll give some examples, I guess. And when 3D printing came out, my husband and I are sculptors, and we were like, oh God, this is gonna take over our jobs. And then we saw that there's this like foam cutting machine that was kind of like the opposite of a 3D printer. It was a subtractive process. It would cut the foam, right? And we were like, this is gonna take over our jobs. We were terrified. Now we have a 3D printer, right? Or the third 3D printer that we've owned, I think. And we use it to help create specialized parts, specialized pieces that would take a long time to sculpt in the exacting way that they would need to be sculpted, or maybe even a machine part that needs to be created to a very, very small specification, and then we can take that and do the work that we need to do by saving time. The same is true for, art processes using AI. So my husband is a scenic foreman on a show, and he starts playing around with paint recipes. And he's like, I wonder how AI would help, enhance this. And so he asks AI how to create a wash that one of his employees is having an issue with the recipe. And it has a pretty good answer. And he's like, well, oh, okay. And so then he starts, feeding it more and training it more and having this whole conversation. And now he can kind of like copy and paste something that he's worked to help generate, a step-by-step for someone when he doesn't have the time to sit there and explain it, but he knows that he's trained this conversation with ChatGPT or DeepSeek to the level to where he's confident about the answers. He reads over it, he sends it to his employee, and that saves time. So those are just two small examples. ADR work is a lot, a big one right now. There's AI being used in editing. There's many different applications in the visual and the art department side of things. A lot of people are playing around with concept sketches using AI, but it only gets it to a certain point, right? You need that human element. You take that and then you say, okay, it's like that, but I have this other vision, so use this as a starting point. When the Writers Guild was having this conversation, one of the big points was we don't want to be given a script and told, oh, this is, correct this. It was written by AI. Because that is like the genesis of the work is created by AI and ostensibly scraped from other people's work, right? But it can be useful when you want to spell check, when you want to enhance, when you want to change the tone, when you want to enhance dialogue aspects, So there's different levels, and I think, reminding ourselves of the ethical part of it as we navigate, especially the creative elements of these conversations, and making sure that we're not eliminating people's jobs is the key. But yeah, I think it can be used for so many things, ethically and responsibly.
So I think that there's the usages. There's two sets of usages. There's the ones that are in music anyway, that everything is being invested into, right? And then there's the usages and the tools and stuff that I'm really interested in. And the investment side is kind of interesting. Venture capitalism is really, a lot of times right now, especially going for those unicorns, right? Or decacorns, right? Places that are going to make billions of dollars and disrupt and all of that. Well, the biggest disruption that we could have right now in the music side of things is replacing musicians. When Suno went up, the pitch to venture capitalists was we're going to make a Spotify without musicians. And, it's a bit cynical, but it also gets across the point, the idea of like you can just ask for any music and it generates for you on the fly. I know in our conversation earlier, one of the things that was brought up was like how personalized that could be, which is a really interesting development. But also, it's kind of a cynical approach. The tools that I'm really excited about, the ones that are just starting to get rolling, are the ones that don't get a lot of funding, but they're the ones that address like artist needs, right? And again, we're on the music side of things, we're last. So I've already seen stuff happening for being able to write better, screenplays and stuff like that, or be able to do image editing and stuff, things like that. On the music side of things, we're just barely getting to stuff where we can say, oh, I want that sound removed, and it removes that sound, or I want these stems, and it pulls the stems so that you can then do the editing. So you could do voiceover, just all that kind of stuff. And those innovative tools are really, really interesting. They don't make a lot of money, but they're super interesting. And so seeing where they're coming out of is kind of an interesting thing. A lot of times it's like artists' very pet projects that are happening, or from like academia in places like this where they have that kind of support and the ability to cross between the disciplines and meet with the CS folks and the engineering folks and develop stuff together. But those are the spots that I'm most excited about, and there's some really interesting stuff that's happening.
You mentioned, an anime example and accelerating your time to development and getting on the screen. There's one thing that, at least personally, from my perspective as an actor, it's going to be very challenging for the threat to the actor, for an audience member to say, oh, that's just as good as George Clooney's work when I'm watching this new artificial intelligence generated performance. But I think there could be a market, and we've had that conversation, there could be a market for individuals saying, this is the story that I want to see. This is the story that I want to hear. Give me something in that framework based upon all the data that you have on my viewership and what I have in my recordings, and then generate something that may be entertaining. That may be another, market, just like video games, anime, live action, animation films, etc. That's possible. But I think that, we have the conversation about that uncanny valley. I think as humans, we want to see the difference. We want to be able to recognize, oh, that's CGI. Oh, Christopher Nolan really took the time to shoot all of those different spots and go to those different locations, as opposed to just utilizing a matte painting or CGI to make it look like it was there. I think there's going to be I look forward to seeing the differentiation between those scenarios. From a producer standpoint, accelerating that time frame, of course, as an actor and a producer, there's so much paperwork that goes on in production to comply with the Screen Actors Guild, the Directors Guild, the IA, the Writers Guild, etc. in that process. But a lot of that work, even before the advent of artificial intelligence as we know it now, we were always saying there's got to be a better way than all this paperwork that we have. And there's an opportunity for us to auto-generate, oh, here's an actor, here's a crew member, etc. We have everything that we need in the database. We need to fill out these forms in compliance with the state for tax credits, for their contracts, making sure that we're in compliance with the union processes. But you still need that subject matter expert to be able to look at that data, verify that data, and the artist to also verify that data. But it certainly could accelerate the tedium of those paperwork processes, and therefore Now it frees up those crew members to do things that are more valuable to what's going up on screen and what you're producing. So there are lots of opportunities to leverage that and also upskill. I don't think it's I'm a little optimistic with regard to individuals and how we leverage artificial intelligence to reduce how many humans we need to do a job. But those same humans have the opportunity to upskill, to become subject matter experts, to embrace the advent of this technology and its ubiquitous impact on multiple industries. So again, I'm quite optimistic. However, I do know that there are opportunities, just like if you're working on a ladder, you've got to be aware of what you're doing and what your surroundings are to make sure that you're safe, people around you are safe, and you're also recognizing individuals' intellectual property and their work as artists and technicians.
I just wanted to add something really quick. The models like Sora and some of these AI systems that are coming out and creating full videos, you can still tell. And I think it's going to be quite a while until you can't tell. There's a lot of conversation about personalized content and the industry possibly moving, in that direction. And one day you can turn on Netflix and say, I want to watch a sci-fi film with, George Clooney doing X, Y, Z, and it creates it for you, But there's the human element is taken out of that to a large degree, and I think we all want that human element. We can all still tell, it's not the same thing when AI first started generating images and there were 10 fingers on one hand and 3 fingers on the other hand. You're like, yeah, that's definitely not made by a human, or a very creative human at that. It's a different type of uncanny valley, but it's still there. The other question being intellectual property. There was recently a company that went and pitched a lot of the Hollywood studios, and it's an ethically sourced AI system that has gotten permission and paid the creators so that it can train on those creators' work and then produce a product for those big companies. The big companies are also, the big production companies are also looking at creating systems for themselves based on their own content. There's a lot of research, development, and creation that I think still needs to be done in that area.
I just want to put another point on that. Adobe put out, they do all their AI training on their own library of, they own the license to all the things that they're training it on. And so if you use their tools, one of their big selling points is that it's using and not infringing on other artists' rights. And if you get litigated against for copyright, they will defend you in court, which is wild. You think about the situation that you would need to be in that kind of, what kind of situation you would need to be in as a company to need to offer that so that someone would feel comfortable using those tools. It's wild. Right now it's just super interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, talking a little bit about the sort of current inflexibility of the tools as tools are getting built for artists and it's becoming better. But we rely on directors and producers sort of as curators to have taste, to say, this is what is good, this is how a 2-hour movie should be structured. And one of the big criticisms right now is that, if a huge film, you have 500 people working for you, you can choose every pixel, but it's very difficult to edit or make any choices in AI content today. You may not be able to get the flexibility and the capabilities that you're used to. Yeah, have you run into any of that? Maybe not.
Yeah, no, what you mentioned, in that discussion earlier is that, to that point, is looking at the director. Again, I got to put on my actor's hat, but I can throw out some ideas, and the director said, "Oh, that's good. Let's tweak that just a little bit. Let's try this, from another vantage point. I don't think you're that angry, or I think you need to be a little tougher in that scenario." You're looking at the overall story. So to be able to curate that from an artificial intelligence perspective, you're doing multiple iterations of a prompt. You're evaluating what you're looking at. So having that same type of opportunity to look at the industry as a whole. In my doctoral studies, I worked on a a film and really looked at the ecosystem of film production and how could we optimize that film production process, looking at the community of film production, and that all of these individuals, at the time we were doing a ABC pilot, and my wife and I did the last project, had 120 individuals. How can we make this production process more efficient? What are we missing in that process? And it said, okay, these are great suggestions, but remember, this is the story that we're in, this is the location that we're in, and more importantly, this is the budget that we're running under. So in that process, to be able to, continue to, adjust that process, to be that curator, I think that's not going to go away. And I think that's the value that we have as humans in relationship to artificial intelligence, particularly in the entertainment industry.
Kind of on the opposite, would you haven't thought about that, Jesse?
So many thoughts. One of the things that's so interesting about new technology when it hits is the first thing that people try to do with it is something that has already been done. They try to use it in a way that they know how, what could it do, and that's the vision for it, right? And right now we're at that. This is a big boundary, right? We can make short things that are really convincing, but to make things that are longer, that have structure, that have direction, that have changes in emotion and all that sort of stuff, right? That's a boundary that we're working on crossing right now. And so, there's tons of AI being used in every TikTok video, in every, anyway, it's everywhere. It's everywhere, but in these short scale things. So that long scale stuff, I think, is a really interesting step that we're headed into. I'm really excited about when we stop trying to duplicate and then we start trying to make AI art. Because what is AI art? Is it a song? Like all the other songs? In fact, based on all the other songs we've had in human history? Or is it something else? Like, what could we do with it? And I think that's, our tools are getting to the point where that's becoming a realistic thing. You're starting to see some really weird, interesting, approaches to using it.
Yeah, that leads right into exactly what I was going to say, which is that sort of on the opposite tack, the venture capital firms and the big AI companies sort of leapt ahead and forged these roads. But we're seeing as tools get developed that indie creators, smallest creators, and probably more the smaller they are getting incredible capabilities from this, and they're willing to experiment. We've seen consolidation in the music industry for the largest companies for decades after digital music. We're seeing, and we're going to see probably an enormous consolidation in Hollywood if it continues to exist in that way. And a lot of it, this may be a harsh thing to say, but you could say that maybe one too many Marvel movies were made. Maybe one too many pop songs were made. Does the budget of something make it neutral in a way that it's palatable to everyone but not enjoyable to anyone? Will we see indie creators rise? So you have an actor, but that actor can put any background behind him, get sound design. Will we see powerful indie creators making enormous varieties of content that people will... I'll stop talking.
I was just going to say, I think it's an incredible opportunity right now. The state of the industry we need indie creators because the big companies, the big studios have gotten so big that, yeah, there's like 1 million Marvel shows now. And yeah, lots of people like Marvel, but not everybody wants to see all Marvel movies. And a lot of the bigger a project gets, it's not just one person's vision, and the corporate stuff really starts to factor in a bigger way. So they start looking at, okay, what is going to make me the most money, rather than let's follow this idea to see where it can go, which is how some of the most amazing art throughout human history has been made. It reminds me of this question that was asked on the first day when I went to NOCA, in my first art class, what is art versus what is craft? Getting so big, some of these productions take that the creative element out of it increasingly. So I think that the way that AI can help leverage time and make things cheaper and create new tools can really help indie creators in creating these new incredible ideas. And it's not, I'm gonna, type in something and get this film shot out of an AI system that's trained on all these other filmmakers. I mean, I'm an artist, we steal, right? But like, it's inspiration, it's not the basis. It's, I've seen all these amazing paintings in this museum and seen all these things, throughout my life, and it's a synthesis of that, and it's not that simple, because human emotion and the weird ways that our brains are structured and the hormones and the chemicals that are going through, AI doesn't have that, so I think it goes down to that human element, and I think that we crave that in art, whether it's a piece of literary work or a painting or a film. We want to see that reflection of the humanity and like the flawed nature of our humanity in that. Like when I'm reading a book, I want to see those deep, weird thoughts, that bring us all together kind of as humans. I think the industry is changing with the bottom line being such a focus for the distributors and the major studios. I think the indie film market and the creativity there is really going to experience a kind of big opportunity and a renaissance. And I'm hoping that some of these tools can be used as tools, not as the product.
I'll just add to that. I think that's an excellent point with regard to independent film and artificial intelligence. When you look at the studios, working with the studios, they're cruise ships where independent filmmakers are PT boats. They don't have a lot of weight. There's not a lot of gas in the tank, but they can pivot and they can move swiftly and they can do things without going through the factors of corporate studio work and all the legal ramifications and guardrails that are placed on a studio adopting a new technology. For example, there's so many times where, as an independent filmmaker, you have these aspirational filmmakers. I want to work with the Arri cameras or the Panavision cameras because that's what the big boys are using. Well, guess what? We can only afford a Blackmagic. We can only afford a Canon, and that's what we're working on. So please, let's make it work. And they do, and they're thinking disruptively. And you made me think of Beasts of the Southern Wild, if you remember that. I wasn't on that project, but I was on a project where and it was a studio film, but a lot of the crew members were just coming off of Beasts of the Southern Wild, very celebrated film in Louisiana. And not in a negative way. They said, these folks, professionals, young people, had never done a film before. They didn't know what they were doing, but they didn't know what not to do. So they were just thinking creatively about how to get the shot or the vision that they had in their mind. And I think that's the open door that prompt engineering and artificial intelligence can provide these independent filmmakers, because they can just break things, try it multiple times to see if it works. Where, of course, in the studio, we can't do that. We have intellectual property issues. We're not going to utilize this technology because we don't have a long-standing contract with them. We have a contract with this company, et cetera, et cetera. So it stagnates that level of creativity where you're seeing the same types of content come out over and over again for the 15th time because it made profit the last 14 times, as opposed to something more new, more innovative, and more disruptive in that process. So I think the embracing artificial intelligence, particularly from the independent filmmaker, we're going to see a lot of work, a lot of innovation, a lot of opportunity come out of those filmmakers embracing that process, and then you're going to see the studios respond because it's been proven by the guys that that's all they had. And now, with studios, you always are hearing, but this is the way we've done it for the last 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. And it has to be something that's proven before we adopt it. Not the case in independent film, so they can move a lot faster and a lot more nimble.
Jesse, and then we're going to take some questions.
Okay. This discussion got me thinking about 5 years ago. It was announced that there was more video being uploaded to YouTube or streamed to YouTube every day than a human could watch in an entire lifetime. we're now talking about generative AI. Publishing houses are having to rework how they do things because there's so much automatically generated music being submitted to Apple Music, to Tidal, to all of those, to the publishing houses. I remember it was about 4 years ago that a really renowned comic book publisher had to stop taking submissions because they were getting overwhelmed with AI-generated comics. And they didn't really have a line either way, but there was no way for them to review the comics for publication, all the ones that they were getting submitted. So they had to figure something out. So they stopped for about 6 months and then came out with a policy and went forward with that. So it's like this really crazy situation that we're at right now where, we can use this stuff to generate things, but we're also able to flood. I keep thinking back about the Spotify without any musicians. If you recall, I think it was 6 months ago, somebody went to jail because they made their own AI agents that went ahead and listened to only their music to influence it to be, so they're not just generating the music, but then they're generating the people to listen to the music so they would then get paid the money, right? Like it's this weird, and that we rely on those kinds of recommendation systems to be able to find those nuggets of like what somebody did that was so interesting and so cool. And anyway, it's a hold on to your hats kind of situation right now. It's cool.
Yeah, and with new tools coming out that like can go and do tasks for you on the internet now, like that's it's like still in kind of like a beta mode right now, but it's gonna happen, and we're probably gonna see a lot more of consumer generation, which is like that creates a whole other ethical question.
Absolutely. All right, we're getting close on time. I think we'll take some questions from the audience, if there are any.
If y'all don't mind, I've been trying to craft this question so I can get to the point. This is for Dr. Marcus and Dr. Jesse. Coming from the music industry, lived in Los Angeles for some years working for the labels, and once I've been here in Louisiana, like you said, Dr. Jesse, the culture of music here in Louisiana. My question is, in this era of AI creating music, as far as the streaming platform, creating music, putting it on the platform, competing, the artists that are creating music, competing with AI-generated music, and then also getting very little on royalties from the music that they're getting for the streaming platforms. Are there some things that are in place or being created to help support our artists in the state make a living on this music that they're creating to bless this world with? I mean, I know this kind of loaded question.
I don't know of any specifics, but I was on, this was years ago, Governor Blanco created a music commission, and I was appointed as a board member to the music commission, and we really focused on the sound recording tax credits. They're still in place, but to be able to protect the artist, there are things in place, and we license music. We have to make sure that we have all the clearances. Artificial intelligence can accelerate that process. I think it's important, but also, artists are competing against the machine itself that I'm seeing, where you're getting pennies on the dollar for your streams, et cetera. There's a huge issue there. And I can equate that to, being an actor, being here in Louisiana, as many films as I've done. Oh, you're in Louisiana, you're not in LA, so I don't have to pay you as much. So you're already here, and it's like, if I had to pay you more, you'd be in LA. It's like, well, is my work any better or worse in that process? So I get that from a musician standpoint and an artist standpoint. I think it's important, but I don't see anything or I'm knowledgeable of anything with regard to that yet, but I think those are the parts of the conversation. But what does that look like as well? There's a need, but what does it look? What does the solution look like?
There was a really well-crafted, interesting nugget at one of the early statement at one of the earlier presentations that musicians are making more money now than they ever had at their performances.
Yeah.
Basically, they're selling merch, and that's how people are making their money, right? And a lot of the business of music on the musician side of things has gone over to that, running their own Discord so they can make connections with the people, and then, you know, creating merch so that people can buy the shirts, the hats, not just the album, right, and the LP, because we want to go, you know, a little nostalgia and people will buy it, right? And so like you're really working on that artist, you're selling as an artist, not necessarily you're selling as the music. And then but I don't know of much. There've been a few interesting like explorations of different ways to publish stuff, like Bandcamp is another one, so like direct to your audience, where people then, you get a much larger cut of each sale. But outside of that, and a couple of kind of other explorations like that, there hasn't been a big, you know, it's interesting.
Got another question up front? So everybody can hear.
Sure. So I want to ask, with the, I guess, I don't want to say automation, but it's easier and easier to create content. How do you feel about the relationship between quality and quantity, and how you, I guess, stay ahead?
I kind of, go ahead, please.
So in the film and television industry, in like from late 2020, early 2021 through like early 23, the studios were like really focusing on quantity. They were trying to figure out how to make money on streaming, and they were like throwing everything at the wall, like, and seeing like, okay, which spaghetti noodle sticks, and then they realized that they were like spending a lot of money on, and not everything was being produced with quality. You can fast, cheap, and easy, you know, like you can only have 2 of those. And, you know, so because there was so much content getting produced, just here in Louisiana, we couldn't even find enough crew members to staff. We were constantly bringing people in. There's just so much production going on, which was fantastic for our workforce here. But at the same time, after doing that for like a year and a half, 2 years, they realized, you know, we need to focus more on quality and, you know, maybe not throw all of the noodles, spaghetti noodles at the wall. Maybe like, you know, scale back. And the unfortunate thing about that is that it's scaled back so much. It's kind of like a contraction and an expansion in the industry, right? So like it expanded really big. And so there was all this content being produced, and then it kind of contracted. It's very much like a roller coaster in many ways, you know, working in this industry, because there are trends and you know, things that happen that dictate you know, your work throughout the year. But that said, I think, you know, as you know, artists and you know, technicians, we all strive to get that high quality work. We all take pride in our work, and as union members, the reason that we're able to get really competitive wages and you know, sit across the bargaining table from employers is because we have these skills that the employers need to make their films. And so what I would say is, you know, think about the quality of your own work and use that for your own bargaining power, because you can train yourself. Use AI to, you know, like help, you know, with some of your processes, but don't depend on it for the basis of your creation. You know, use it to help, but the quality of your work still has to be authentic and unique in you. You know what I mean? And I think, you know, like I said before, we're all kind of looking for that in these major works of art that we want to, you know, content that we want to consume.
Great. Next question.
The only thing there with quality and quantity, you know, as a musician, as an artist, etc., you can hang your hat on one song, you can hang your hat on one audition, you can hang your hat on one script, and you can polish that into oblivion. But if you're not connecting with an audience, then you won't know, and you can't validate that, and then you can't reiterate and do it again, just like we're talking about prompt engineering. So then you've got an opportunity to look at quantity and look at the balance between the two. Okay, let's put something out. It may not be perfect, but maybe that's not, the right thing, and maybe that's not resonating with an audience. Oh, that one resonated a little bit more. Now I can tweak that a bit more, and now I can continue to enhance my quality while enhancing my quantity, and therefore, you're spreading your opportunities. To your point of getting ahead, yeah, you've got to get out there. You've got to shoot more than one basket. In my opinion.
I would say too that there's more than one market, right? There's a market for just quantity. For instance, music, right? People who just play stuff in in an airport, wherever. They don't necessarily want to have to license all of this music, right? They just want something in the backgrounds, but it's not dead quiet, right? And AI generated stuff is going to work great for that. Next time you hang or you're on a phone call, and have to be put on hold, you don't need to hear the latest and greatest, the top 10 hits, right? You're going to hear something's just generated for you. And anyway, it's an interesting thing. I think one of the issues we run into is that a lot of artists really like to do the homing thing. And that's what they want. They want to make this super, super quality thing. They don't necessarily want to do any of the marketing of it, or the sales of it, or that side of things. And so even though they have this amazing quality, they don't necessarily reach the right people who would appreciate it. And anyway, there's so many opportunities for different, arts organizations and stuff like that to be able to kind of bring that out.
Yeah, we were talking about a little bit about the democratization of the arts, and especially in music, we see that with the dramatically decreased dependence on record labels, but artists who are not on one at all are doing their own marketing, their own connecting, but that is something that the most recent largely text-based AI tools can be really great for, is just being a personal assistant that has graphic design skills, that has so for projects where you were never going to be able to afford a team, there's a much better chance for democratization of artists and reaching your network, and if you're only making $1, but you might be getting that whole dollar, that can be really meaningful. All right, well, it's been a real pleasure to be up here with you, and thank you very much for having us today.